Welcome everyone to this first online StatCentral monthly seminar, where I will talk a bit about dichotomizing variables, why it's a common practice and why maybe you shouldn't do it.
I'm sorry, Peter, we seem to be losing your sound. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm trying again. Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, let's try again. So, yeah, I don't know where you lost me. So I was saying that you might be conducting a research study where you have some continuous outcome measure and you're interested in how that relates to some other variable. And I will, for simplicity's sake, today just focus on a single explanatory variable, but everything applies just as much when you have multiple variables to take care of, and in fact, even more so. So your explanatory variable might, in the general case, be continuous or discrete, but certainly things seem to be a lot easier when your explanatory variable is dichotomous. If you just have two different groups that you're comparing, that's really convenient. You have a sort of a simple comparison that you can make, and you can say, you know, this group A responded a lot more than group B, say. And really, wouldn't it be nice if we could make the same sort of statements with a continuous explanatory variable and just be done with it? So why don't we just go and take our continuous variable and create two groups out of that, make our life simple. Comparing two groups is generally pretty easy to do. And it also tends to be easy to interpret because you can say, well, this group had a much larger response than the other, and we can make some sense of that. It can also be easier to then put that into practice somehow, because you know, group A might benefit from this treatment, say, and maybe group B doesn't. But I'm here today to tell you that this usually isn't the solution you're looking for, and we'll take a closer look at why that is. So to make things a bit more concrete, let's just consider a completely fictitious study with made-up data.
Peter, 1 second. Could you ask people to put up their hands if they can't hear? There's still some people who can't hear.
Right, sure. If you're still having Okay, so we're still having some problem with people who can't hear.
Thanks, Peter. Keep going.
Okay. Right. So consider a study I made up for the purpose of this seminar, where we might be interested in finding out how people feel about using online video conferences instead of face-to-face meetings. I'm sure you can all relate to that at the moment. And so a question that might arise in the process of studying that is, to what extent this willingness to participate in online meetings or sort of general attitudes towards that are influenced by the speed of the internet connection. And so we're going to pretend that we measure the attitude towards video conferences as on some continuous scale, as well as internet speed, which will be our explanatory variable. And we'll try to see how the two relate to each other. So now you might say, well, this is all very well and good, but I don't really care about the exact your change in attitudes based on a small change in internet speed. I really just want to compare people who have high and low speed internet connection. So after collecting all this data, we then just go and create two groups by dichotomizing internet speed. And then do our analysis, and it will all be nice and simple. So the first thing we have to do for this is to create two groups. And for that, we have to choose some sort of threshold where we're going to say, well, everyone who's below this has slow internet and everyone who's above this has fast internet. Something people do in studies is that they say, well, there's some sort of commonly accepted threshold. And if you fall below this, you're in one group, and you fall above this, you fall into another. Common examples, I think, like BMI, right? If you have a BMI of above 30, then you're considered obese. And if you're below, then you're not. And with internet speed, there might be some threshold relating to, say, the recommended internet speed of your favorite video conferencing software. Or we could go and say, well, we just create two equal sized groups by either, well, one thing is you could do a median split, right? So you take the lower half, that's your slow internet, and the top half, that's your fast internet. Or you could say, well, we're not going to look at all that stuff that's going on in the middle. Maybe it's better to look at the extremes and say, look at the bottom third and the top third, and those are going to be our low and fast groups. So there are different options, and we'll see what they'll do. But let's look at some data. So as you set out to conduct your study, you might imagine that your data will look something like this, where you have several participants with slow internet connections and a lot of participants with fast internet connections. And so that will be your data. The speed of the internet is on the x-axis here, and the willingness to participate in video conferences on the y-axis. And then we can say use a median split, just cut it up in the middle, and we create two beautiful groups that separate our data into slow and fast internet connections, and we can then compare these two groups, and that looks like it's working rather well. So you have the two groups. You can then happily go and compare them using a t-test, say, and that in this case would tell you that these two groups are rather different, and it would estimate that the difference in the willingness to participate in these video conferences is about 2 on this fictitious scale we're using to measure this, which, well, it would estimate to be 1.92, which is close to the truth, which is 2. So this worked nicely. So why am I sitting here trying to tell you that you shouldn't do this? Well, the thing is that, of course, this was an example where this happened to work. In reality, maybe your data would end up looking more like this, which actually looks quite similar to the data set before. But if you now went and applied that same median split we did before, so you take the median of this data set and again cut it up in the middle, it now unfortunately happens that this doesn't really seem to separate between slow and fast internet connections, because it turns out not exactly half of our sample had slow internet connections. And so we end up with a situation that's rather more messy. And here you can also see one of the other problems with this approach is that you'll have a group of samples here that are very close to the cut point we've chosen. And then some fall on one side, one on the other, and they're completed as completely different things, even though they are very close together, very similar. Now, instead, we could say, okay, maybe the middle, it's a bit messy, just look at the extremes, and then maybe things will work better. And in this example, they would work slightly better, as you can see. Of course, at the cost of throwing away a good chunk of your data. But even though it works a little bit better, it's still not great. The difference between the groups that we should be seeing here, as I can tell you because I generated this data myself, and so I know what the right answer here is, which is again 2. And so even though just looking at the extremes works slightly better, it's still not really particularly close to the right answer. And what's even more worrying is that if you use a different cut point, like say the median, you get a rather different answer. And how do you know which one is the right one? So really, this illustrates the problem that if you try to take a continuous variable and force it into a dichotomy that may or may not exist, it is basically impossible to do that without losing quite a lot of information. And even though in this case I have generated the data in a way so that there really are two groups, using simple rules like a median split, it is essentially impossible to recover those groups and end up with a comparison that makes sense. And if you use the wrong split, your answers might be completely different from what is actually going on. So the question obviously is, what do you do? What's a better way to deal with this? And generally the answer is try to model data you have, in this case, the one continuous explanatory variable. Try to model the relationship between that and your response directly, rather than messing with the data first. Of course, this does require some effort to figure out what an appropriate model might be. And things you could consider here is maybe try a linear regression. Or maybe the reality is a bit more difficult and complex, and you might want to look at nonlinear models or some different approach. So let me briefly show an example of how this might work. So if you want to go and model the relationship between continuous variables directly, and it seems reasonable to us that there might be a linear relationship between the two, we could attempt to fit a linear model that will basically try to explain the attitudes towards video conferencing as a linear function of the internet speed. And here, so here we see the data again with the red line showing us the linear model I fitted to the data. And the gray line is what the actual truth might look like in this case. Well, if it were really a linear relationship. So this looks like it kind of works, and if you, but well, we might look at it in a little bit more detail. And what it is telling us basically is that if we increase somebody's internet speed by 0.93 on this internet speed rating scale, then, no, I'm sorry, I did say that exactly the wrong way around, didn't I? If we increase somebody's internet speed by 1 point on the internet rating scale, then their willingness to participate in the online meetings will increase by 0.93. Which, as it turns out, is a slightly better description of what's going on in this data than our previous attempts based on the dichotomized internet speed, where well, these correspond to the this greenish line and the orange line here. But still, it's not really great, right? So what happened here? Well, the linear model did seem better than just using two somewhat arbitrarily defined groups, which maybe shouldn't be a big surprise, because A, we didn't have to choose some arbitrary threshold to create those groups, and were able to make use of all the data rather than summarizing some of it first before doing our modeling. But there clearly is room for improvement. It doesn't really look like this linear model produced a great fit, and the parameter estimate, if you look at it, isn't really that great. So if the model were perfect, then this red line should be right on top of the gray line. And clearly it isn't, right? So something's still not quite right. And a possible explanation for this might be that maybe the relationship really isn't linear and things are more complicated. And this really highlights the point that you do need the right model, or well, an appropriate model for your data. And to be able to produce a good analysis, it is important to really understand what is going on with your data. And while simple models can be convenient to use, if you oversimplify things, it's likely to go badly. So dichotomizing your continuous variables is probably not the right answer. You, by some simplicity, by giving up quite a lot of information, sometimes by literally throwing away data, and sometimes by just losing information due to summarizing your data. And it can seriously obscure the real relationship between your variables, which typically is what you are specifically interested in. And as a result, can lead to rather misleading conclusions. And unfortunately, it seems that the figure I had here has somehow been messed up. Yeah, this one isn't any better. Let me quickly try to fix that. Oh, there we go. And yes, so here is an example of what a model that is closer in line with what I use to generate the data might look like, where you do indeed have two different groups with a nonlinear relationship between them. And if you go and fit a sort of sigmoid function like this to that model, you could then maybe do a slightly better job at retrieving the information you wanted from it, namely the sort of average willingness to participate in online meetings in the two groups here, as well as a sort of point in between, halfway in between, that allows you potentially to separate these two groups if that is something you wanted to do down the line. Now, admittedly, this is all a little bit more complicated than just comparing two groups, and it might be a bit daunting at first, especially when you are new to this sort of thing and might not even know where to start. But fortunately, we are here to help. So if this is something you might have to do for your own research, you can come and talk to us come for a consultation, and we'll see what we can do and what might be the right model for your data. And we also offer short courses, several of which are running in May, that may be of interest. And that brings me to the end of this presentation. And if you have some questions, we could maybe answer those.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand or type them into the chat window, and we'll make sure Peter sees them and answer them for everyone.
Oh, yeah, so we have a question asking about what you might do to figure out which model to use, which is a very good question, of course. The very first thing I would do is plot your data. There's really nothing better than to actually look at your data to get a sense of what's going on. You will often also have some sort of expectations of what model might be appropriate based on sort of your understanding of or expectation of the relationships you might expect to see, as well as what other people have done with their analysis in your field previously. And all of that together might give you some idea. And then once you've settled on a model that you think might be reasonable, that these models usually come with a number of assumptions that they make, and that you could then check to see whether that is actually appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. We appreciate what you told us. To all the attendees, thank you so much for coming. I think we had a few little blips there. If you wanted to send us an email about any problems or technical difficulties that you had, that will help us for our next online courses, and so we can help things go a bit more smoothly. This is our first one, so I'm not surprised if we had a few little bumps. Thank you so much, and have a good day.